The alarms on my ship were screaming before I even opened my eyes. I had been asleep for less than an hour when the deck beneath me shook so hard that my chair nearly tipped over. My name is Vesic Thorin, and I have served the Kale Dominion for over 60 cycles. I have commanded fleets across 1,000 worlds. I have seen surrenders signed within hours of first contact. I had never once, in all my years of service, been woken up by an enemy that was supposed to be finished fighting. We called it the Sol Campaign, a small, unremarkable system, third planet from a yellow star, home to a species we had classified as pre-Starflight and mostly harmless. Our analysts told the High Council it would take 14 days to bring the planet called Earth under Dominion control. 14 days. I remember laughing quietly when I read that number, because in my experience, even the proudest species tended to kneel within a week once we showed them the size of our fleet. I stood on the bridge of my ship, the Ashvane, and looked at the tactical display. 3 of our escort vessels were gone, not damaged. Gone. My second officer, a calm and steady soul named Doran, looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. "Commander," he said, "they are not retreating." I told him to repeat the sensor readings because I assumed it was an error. Their fleet was outnumbered 11 to 1. Their largest ship was a fraction of the size of mine. According to every rule of war I had ever studied, they should have already sent a surrender signal. Instead, 3 of their smaller vessels broke formation and flew directly into the heart of our formation, weapons blazing, shields long since failed, hulls glowing red from strain. They rammed us. I want you to understand what that means to someone like me. In the Dominion, we fight wars the way a surgeon performs an operation. Calculated. Efficient. Every loss weighed against every gain. Every battle ended the moment the mathematics turned unfavorable. We built an empire not through cruelty but through precision, because a defeated enemy who surrenders quickly can be rebuilt into a productive province. A defeated enemy who fights until the last breath is simply a waste of resources. These humans did not seem to understand mathematics at all. We took the system within 3 days despite this. Their ships were old, their weapons were crude by our standards, and no amount of courage changes the outcome when the numbers are so lopsided. I remember standing over the tactical display as our forces secured orbit around their capital city, and I felt something close to relief. Perhaps the analysts had been wrong about the 14 days, but they had been right about the ending. The humans had lost. It was over. It was not over. I ordered my forces to begin standard pacification protocol. This is a procedure we have used on countless worlds. Land troops in key population centers, disable communication networks, present terms of surrender to remaining local leadership, and wait for the population to accept the inevitable. I have walked this exact path more times than I can count. Populations grieve, populations resist for a short while, and then populations adapt. It is the natural order of conquest. My lead ground officer, a sharp young soldier named Petra Vel, who despite the name was of my own people and not human, sent me a report from the surface that I still remember word for word. She wrote that a human settlement, fewer than 400 residents, with no weapons capable of harming our armored vehicles, refused to open their gates. When our forces breached the perimeter without resistance expected, they found the town empty of soldiers but full of ordinary people standing in the street, unarmed, unmoving, refusing to leave their homes even as our vehicles rolled past them. We did not harm them. Our protocol does not require harming a population that offers no violent resistance. But something about that scene disturbed Petra Vel enough that she requested a private conversation with me that evening, rather than simply filing her report. "Commander," she said, "they know they cannot win. They know it as well as we do. So why are they still standing there?" I did not have an answer for her then. I do not think I fully have one now, though I understand it far better than I did that night. The following week, we captured a human soldier during a skirmish near a river crossing. He was young, perhaps in his 20s by their aging standards, with fair hair and a wound across his shoulder that our medical staff treated without complication. His name, according to the identification we found on him, was Daniel Ashworth. He was a soldier from what they called the Eastern Defense Line, a position that had already fallen 2 days earlier. I visited him personally in the medical bay, partly out of professional curiosity. In my experience, prisoners taken shortly after defeat tend to be either broken with despair or burning with a fury that fades within days. Daniel Ashworth was neither. He looked at me with tired eyes, and when I asked him, through our translation device, whether he understood that his side had lost the battle, he nodded without hesitation. "Yes," he said, "we lost the river." I asked him if he was frightened. He thought about the question for a long moment, and then he said something that I have turned over in my mind every day since. "I am not frightened for myself. I am sorry I could not hold the line long enough for the others to get the bridge rigged." He was not apologizing to me. He was not even truly speaking to me. He was apologizing to people who were not in the room, people he would likely never see again, for a failure that by every reasonable standard was not even his fault. He had been outnumbered, outgunned, and wounded, and still the thing occupying his mind in defeat was not his own survival, but whether his failure had cost someone else theirs. I left the medical bay that night and did not sleep. I have interrogated soldiers from 100 different species across my career. Fear ends resistance. This is not cruelty, it is simply fact, the same way water flows downhill. Every species I had ever encountered eventually reached a point where the personal cost of continued fighting outweighed whatever cause they were fighting for, and in that moment, resistance ended. It was not weakness. It was sense. Daniel Ashworth had reached that point, by any calculation I could construct, days earlier. He had been defeated, wounded, and captured, and still, lying in a medical bed on an enemy ship, the thing that kept him awake was concern for people who were not there to know whether he felt it or not. I began reviewing every report from the surface with new attention after that conversation. A pattern started to emerge that unsettled me more with each new report I read. Human settlements that had lost every meaningful ability to resist continued sending supplies toward the front lines, days and sometimes weeks after those front lines had collapsed. Human communication networks that we had disabled kept reappearing through methods our engineers could not immediately explain, cobbled together from equipment that should not have functioned at all. Human civilians who had every legal and practical reason to accept quiet lives under our administration instead quietly redirected resources, delayed our supply convoys, and passed information between towns that our sensors somehow failed to detect. None of it was coordinated in any way our analysts recognized. There was no central command issuing these orders. It was simply happening in 1,000 small places at once, as if resistance itself had become something these people breathed, rather than something they were instructed to do. I brought my concerns to Fleet Marshal Orenthal Kess, my superior, during a routine briefing aboard the flagship. He listened to my account of Daniel Ashworth, of the town that refused to move, of the strange persistence of their networks, and he waved a hand as though brushing away smoke. "Vesic," he said, "every conquered people mourns before they adapt. This is nothing new. Give it time." I wanted to believe him. He had conquered more worlds than I had, and his instincts had guided the Dominion to victory across 1,000 campaigns. But something in my chest refused to settle, the way an animal refuses to rest when it senses a predator it cannot yet see. That night, I requested access to historical records about this species, something our analysts had apparently not thought necessary before the invasion began. I read until the ship's morning cycle began, and by the time I finished, my hands were unsteady in a way I had not felt since my earliest days in service. I had assumed, as our analysts had assumed, that a pre-Starflight species with a short recorded history would have little experience with prolonged conflict. What I found instead was a species whose entire recorded history was, in some form, a chronicle of losing everything and continuing regardless. Cities burned to the ground and rebuilt taller, populations reduced by plague and warfare to a fraction of their former size, only to recover within a few generations and continue building. Wars fought not for years but for decades, entire generations who knew nothing but conflict, who somehow still found the will to raise children and plant crops and write songs in the middle of it all. We had classified this species as young and untested. I began to understand, reading late into that long ship's night, that we had instead found a species that had already survived 1,000 of its own private apocalypses, long before it ever knew we existed. I closed the historical files as the first light of the system's star crossed the viewport of my quarters, and I sat there for a long while without moving. In the Dominion, we had built our empire on a simple and reliable truth. Every species has a breaking point, a moment where continued resistance becomes more painful than acceptance, and once you find that point, the war effectively ends. I had built my entire career on finding that point quickly and efficiently in every enemy I faced. I did not yet know it that morning, but I would spend the rest of the Soul campaign searching for a breaking point that simply did not exist. We had been taught across 1,000 years of conquest that fear ends resistance. No one, in all our history, in all our careful study of 1,000 different peoples, had ever told us that for some, fear was not the deciding factor at all. It never had been, and as the days ahead would show me, it never would be. I ordered a full status report from every occupied sector of Earth to be delivered to my desk by the following morning, and I remember writing a short note to Fleet Marshal Kess before I finally allowed myself to rest. "I do not believe this campaign will resolve as quickly as we expect," I wrote. "I do not yet know why, but I intend to find out." I had no idea, as I sealed that message and closed my eyes, how completely my understanding of war itself was about to be dismantled and rebuilt by the very people we had come to conquer. The morning brought new reports, and every one of them carried the same quiet, impossible thread running through it. Somewhere below us, on a small, blue, unremarkable planet that our analysts had promised would fall in 14 days, a species without ships to match ours, without weapons to match ours, without numbers to match ours, had decided that losing was simply not an option they were willing to accept. And for the first time in 60 cycles of service, I found myself wondering if the Dominion had finally met something we did not know how to defeat. The 14-day campaign became a 14-week campaign, and then it became something none of our analysts had a name for at all. I want to describe to you exactly how this happened, because the way it happened taught me more about war than 60 years of service ever had. Our battle computers on the Ashvane were built from centuries of accumulated data, drawn from 1,000 conquered worlds. When we entered a new system, these systems could predict enemy troop movements, resource allocation, and morale collapse with a precision that had never failed us before. I trusted these predictions the way I trusted gravity. I did not question them, I simply acted on them. 3 months into the Soul campaign, my battle computer produced a prediction that a human defense line near a region they called the Northern Ridge would collapse within 6 hours, based on supply shortages, troop fatigue, and the overwhelming force we had massed against them. I ordered a full advance based on that prediction. 6 hours passed. The line did not collapse. 12 hours passed. It still held. By the 18th hour, my battle computer flagged an anomaly it had never flagged before in my entire career. It said, simply, that its confidence in the prediction had fallen below the threshold required to continue offering tactical guidance. I remember standing over that display with my hands folded behind my back, staring at a message my own machines had never been forced to generate before. Insufficient data to model enemy behavior. In 60 years, I had never seen those words. I ordered a full review of our tactical data, assuming an error in our sensors or our data feeds. There was no error. The problem was not with our machines. The problem was that our machines had been trained to understand war as a series of rational calculations, and the humans on that ridge were making choices that violated every rational calculation we understood. I began to study human conflict more closely, and a young intelligence officer named Grace Bellamy assisted me with translating and organizing the records we gathered from captured communication devices and from human historical archives our engineers managed to access. Grace was thorough in a way I appreciated, and she did not flinch from telling me things I did not want to hear. "Commander," she told me one evening, as we reviewed a set of century-old human military records in a conflict from over 100 of their years ago, soldiers on one side dug long trenches into the earth and lived in them for years at a time, in freezing conditions, under constant bombardment, watching entire generations of young men disappear in single mornings of fighting, and still, when commanders called for another advance, most of them went. Not because they believed they would win that particular advance. Many of them wrote letters home saying they expected to die. They went anyway. I asked her why. It was the only question that mattered to me by that point. She looked at the translated documents for a long moment before answering. I do not think it was for victory in the way we understand victory, Commander. I think it was because the person beside them was going, and leaving them to go alone was somehow worse than dying beside them. I sat with that answer for a long time. In the Dominion, we had built an empire on the principle that individuals calculate their own survival above the survival of the group, because ultimately, this is true of nearly every species we had ever encountered. Loyalty to the group exists, but it bends and eventually breaks under sufficient personal threat. This is not a flaw. It is simply how living things are built to endure. I had never questioned it, because I had never seen it fail. The humans on that ridge, I began to understand, had built something different. Not a species without fear, because Grace showed me records of soldiers admitting terror in private, breaking down after battles ended. They were not fearless. They were simply willing to act against their fear in a way our models had never accounted for, because doing otherwise felt to them like a deeper wound than any physical cost could cause. 3 weeks after that conversation, we destroyed a shipyard the humans had built along their eastern coastline, a facility that our intelligence estimated had taken them years to construct and would take them at least as long to rebuild. I remember the satisfaction I felt watching the reports come in. This, finally, was the kind of decisive blow that ended wars. Without the capacity to build ships, their resistance in orbit would collapse within months, and the campaign could finally move toward its conclusion. 3 days later, a fleet of small, hastily constructed vessels attacked our forces in the same sector. They were built from salvaged materials, mismatched parts scavenged from wreckage, and civilian ships repurposed for defense. They should not have existed. Our destruction of the shipyard should have made this fleet impossible for at least half a year, according to every industrial capacity model we possessed. I brought this development to my mentor, an aging fleet commander named Orvain Selk, who had trained me as a young officer and who I trusted more than almost anyone in the Dominion military. He listened to my account with the patient expression he always wore, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "Vesic," he said, "we did not defeat them, we only made them angrier." I asked him what he meant by that, because to me, it sounded like something closer to poetry than military analysis, and I had never known Orvain Selk to speak in poetry. He explained that in every war he had studied, including our own history from before the Dominion unified, there existed a category of enemy that could not be defeated through destruction of resources alone, because their resistance was not fueled by resources in the first place. Destroying their shipyard did not remove their will to build ships. It simply proved to them that we intended to take away their ability to defend themselves, and that proof, rather than discouraging them, seemed to summon an even greater output of effort from people who had every reason to give up, and none, apparently, who felt they were permitted to. I did not fully understand what he meant until I reviewed the records of the workers who built that scavenged fleet. Among them were retired engineers well past their working years, factory workers whose factories no longer existed, and, notably, a number of young people not yet of an age we would consider fit for military labor on most Dominion worlds. Grace found records suggesting that many of these workers had not slept in proper shifts for weeks, choosing instead to work in relays, passing tools from one exhausted set of hands to another rather than allow the work to pause even for the recommended rest periods. I asked Grace to find out, if she could, who had ordered this effort. I expected to find a name, a commanding officer, someone whose authority explained why an entire coastal population had organized itself into a shipbuilding operation within 72 hours of losing its primary shipyard. "There was no order, Commander," she told me. "No single person gave this instruction. It appears to have simply begun, in several places at once, without central direction." This was the moment the true shape of what we faced began to come into focus for me, though I did not yet have the language to describe it fully. We had encountered other species who fought with great ferocity when directly threatened, but that ferocity always traced back to a leader, a doctrine, a chain of command that, if broken, would eventually cause the resistance beneath it to falter and dissolve. This is how the Dominion had conquered 1,000 worlds. Find the head, and the body eventually stops moving in any coordinated way. Humanity did not appear to have a single head in the way we understood the concept. Or rather, it had many, scattered across their entire civilization, each one capable of independently deciding to keep going even when every larger structure around them had already fallen. I began to suspect, though I did not yet say this aloud to anyone, that even if we somehow managed to remove every human leader, every government, every command structure across the entire planet, the resistance itself might simply continue, distributed among millions of individuals who had each, on their own, decided the same thing. I requested a full accounting of our own losses across the campaign, something I had avoided doing directly because the numbers had become uncomfortable to review. When the report arrived, I found that our losses, ship damage, and material expenditure had already exceeded the total cost of our previous 4 campaigns combined, campaigns that had each brought populations many times the size of Earth under our control. And still, according to every strategic model we possessed, we were winning. We held more territory. We had disabled more of their military assets than they had disabled of ours. By the mathematics that had guided the Dominion for 1,000 years, this was a campaign moving steadily toward a decisive and total victory. But the mathematics had never accounted for an enemy that treated the cost of the war as irrelevant to the question of whether to continue it. I began spending time, when my duties allowed, reviewing intercepted human communications that Grace and her team had managed to translate. Not military communications, but ordinary messages between civilians, the kind of small, private exchanges that reveal more about a people than any official record ever could. I read a message from a woman named Charlotte Doyle to her sister, written during a period when the region she lived in had no reliable power or clean water for nearly a month following our orbital strikes. She did not write about despair. She wrote about a system her neighbors had organized to share what little clean water remained, about a school that continued meeting in a partially damaged building because the teacher refused to let the children lose more than they already had, about small, stubborn acts of ordinary life continuing under conditions that should have made ordinary life impossible. I read another message from a young man named Edward Marsh to a friend serving somewhere along a defense line, joking about something trivial, a shared memory from before the invasion, written in a tone so light it was almost impossible to reconcile with the conditions I knew existed along that same defense line only days earlier. I began to understand that humans did not simply endure hardship with grim determination alone. They found room, even in the worst of it, for humor, for small comforts, for connection to one another, as though joy itself had become another form of resistance, another thing they refused to surrender. Orvain Selk, when I shared these observations with him, nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had suspected for some time. "Vesic," he said, "I believe we are no longer fighting an enemy that can be defeated the way we understand defeat. I believe we are fighting an enemy that has redefined what defeat even means, in a way that makes our entire doctrine somewhat obsolete." I did not want to believe him. I had built my identity around the idea that war was a science, that with sufficient force and sufficient patience, any resistance could eventually be reduced to nothing. Standing on the bridge of the ash vein, watching reports come in of scavenged ships, distributed resistance, and communications filled with stubborn, ordinary humanity refusing to be extinguished, I felt the foundation of everything I understood about my profession beginning to crack. Fleet Marshal Kess, when informed of these developments, ordered an intensification of our campaign rather than a reconsideration of it. More ships, more strikes, a greater show of force to finally break whatever strange resilience this species possessed. I followed his orders because that is what soldiers do, but I remember writing in my private log that night a single line I would return to many times in the months that followed. "I fear we are about to discover exactly how far a species will go when it has decided, collectively and individually, that giving up is simply not a language it knows how to speak." I did not yet understand how right I was, or how much more there was still to see. The campaign that followed would show me a version of this species I had not yet imagined possible, one that would force me to abandon nearly everything I believed about the nature of war itself. The world they called Halden's Reach was not important to us strategically. It was a mid-sized settlement, built along a coastline, home to perhaps 2 million people, with no unusual industrial capacity and no significant military installations beyond a few defense platforms in orbit. Fleet Marshal Kess selected it as the site of what he called a demonstration campaign, a concentrated show of force meant to finally break the pattern of resistance that had frustrated us for months. If we could not win the entire war quickly, he reasoned, we could at least win one battle so completely and so visibly that the rest of the planet would understand the futility of continuing. I was given command of the operation. I remember feeling, as I reviewed the plans, a strange mixture of professional confidence and personal unease. We had assembled overwhelming force, more than triple what our models suggested was necessary to secure the settlement within days. Orbital superiority was total. Their defense platforms were destroyed within the first hour of engagement, and I expected, based on every previous campaign I had ever led, that the population below would begin negotiating terms shortly after. We offered evacuation. This is standard Dominion procedure in situations where a settlement's continued existence is not strategically necessary. We broadcast clear instructions in their language, offering safe passage for any civilians who wished to leave before we began securing the area, along with generous terms for those who remained peacefully. In every previous campaign across every previous world we had conquered, this offer had been accepted by the vast majority of the population within hours. Fewer than 3% of Halden's Reach accepted evacuation. I remember staring at that number on my display, certain there had been an error in our broadcast, certain the translation had somehow failed to convey the offer correctly. Grace Bellamy confirmed the message had been received clearly across the entire settlement. The population had simply chosen, almost unanimously, to remain. I ordered ground forces to begin the standard advance, expecting the usual pattern: initial resistance from any remaining military assets, followed by a rapid transition to civilian order once organized defense collapsed. What happened instead defied every category our doctrine had prepared me for. Every factory in the settlement, within days of our arrival, had converted its output towards some form of resistance. A facility that had previously manufactured farming equipment began producing crude armored vehicles from tractor parts and salvaged metal. A textile plant began producing insulated suits designed to reduce our sensors' ability to detect body heat, an innovation our engineers later admitted was cleverly conceived given the materials available. None of this had been ordered by any central authority we could identify. Grace's investigation found records of independent decisions made by individual factory managers, workers, and in several cases, groups of teenagers who had simply decided among themselves what needed to be done, and set about doing it without waiting for permission from anyone. I watched footage recovered from a captured drone showing a woman named Louisa Pemberton, who, according to civilian records, had worked as a schoolteacher before the invasion, directing a group of about 30 people in constructing a barricade from furniture, vehicles, and construction materials pulled from a partially collapsed building. She was not a soldier. She had no military training that our records could find, and yet she organized that group with a clarity and calm authority that our own officers would have respected in a trained commander. The most unsettling development, however, came 3 days into the siege when our forces captured a group of 12 armed civilians attempting to disable one of our supply convoys. Standard protocol called for their immediate transfer to a secure holding facility pending processing, a procedure designed to remove combatants from the field efficiently. What I had not anticipated was what would happen after. The captured humans were treated according to Dominion protocol, which is to say, adequately, with food, medical attention for minor injuries, and no cruelty of any kind, because we have never believed cruelty serves any strategic purpose. Within a day, however, our guards began reporting something strange. The captives were not despairing, were not attempting escape in any of the predictable ways our security protocols anticipated. Instead, they were talking, calmly, among themselves and even occasionally with our guards, asking questions about our home worlds, sharing small jokes, treating their captivity as an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. One of our guards, a soldier under my command named Petra Vell, whom I mentioned earlier from the early days of the campaign, requested a meeting with me after her third day supervising the holding facility. She seemed troubled in a way I had not seen from her before. "Commander," she said, "I do not understand these people. They know their side may lose this settlement. Several of them have told me directly that they expect to remain in captivity for a long time, perhaps permanently, and still they do not behave like a defeated people. They ask about our families. One of them, an older man named Frederick Lowe, spent an hour yesterday teaching one of our younger guards a card game from his own culture, as though we were not adversaries at all. I asked her what she believed was happening. She considered the question carefully before answering. I believe, Commander, that they have decided their situation does not define who they are. I believe they intend to remain exactly the same people, with the same humor and the same kindness, regardless of what happens to them. And I confess, this frightens me more than anything they could have done with a weapon." I understood exactly what she meant, because I had begun to feel the same fear myself, watching reports accumulate from across the settlement. A defeated enemy who despairs can be managed, even pitied. A defeated enemy who remains stubbornly, defiantly themselves, who refuses to allow captivity or loss to change the fundamental shape of their character, presents a problem that no amount of military force can solve, because the thing you are trying to conquer is not a territory or an army. It is a spirit that simply does not recognize defeat as something that changes who it is. The siege of Halden's Reach continued for 6 weeks, far longer than any operation of its scale should have required. During that time, I witnessed things that I still find difficult to describe without a strange mixture of professional frustration and something uncomfortably close to admiration. I watched footage of civilians, ordinary people with no military training, forming supply chains under the cover of night to move food and medical materials between neighborhoods our forces had cut off from one another. I watched a broadcast intercepted from a local communication network, in which a young woman named Isabel Caro, no more than 16 years of age according to the records we found, addressed our forces directly, not with pleading or fear, but with a steady, almost amused defiance, informing us that her city had survived worse storms than us and would still be standing long after we had grown tired and gone home. Our translators confirmed the tone of the message was not bravado meant to conceal fear, but something closer to genuine, settled confidence. I want to describe one incident in particular, because it remains, even now, the clearest example I can offer of what we came to understand as humanity unleashed. On the 40th day of the siege, our forces breached what we believed was the final organized pocket of resistance within the settlement, a converted community center that our intelligence indicated housed the remaining coordinators of the civilian defense effort. We expected, based on every previous engagement, that resistance would collapse once this coordinating group was captured or eliminated. Instead, we found the building nearly empty, staffed by a skeleton crew who had clearly known we were coming and had spent the preceding hours ensuring that responsibility for continuing the defense had been distributed so widely across the remaining population that no single capture could meaningfully disrupt it. Among those we captured in that building was a man named Nathaniel Ford, who our records indicated had been a civilian engineer before the invasion, with no formal military rank of any kind. He had, over the preceding weeks, become one of the most effective coordinators of the settlement's defense, organizing supply routes, communication networks, and improvised production facilities with a skill that our own logistics officers would have envied. When I met him personally, in the aftermath of his capture, I asked him a question that had been building in me for weeks. You must have known, from the beginning, that this settlement could not defeat our forces through direct combat. Why did you dedicate so much effort to a resistance you must have understood was, in strictly military terms, unlikely to succeed? Nathaniel Ford looked at me for a long moment before answering, and I remember his expression carried no anger, no despair, only a kind of tired, patient clarity. "Commander," he said, "you keep speaking of success and failure as though they only mean one thing. Perhaps we could not stop your fleet. But every day we held on was a day my neighbors got to sleep in their own homes. Every supply line we kept open was a family that did not go hungry. Every hour we bought was an hour someone else, somewhere else, had to prepare. That is a kind of success too, even if it does not look like the one you are used to measuring." I did not have a response for him. I had spent 60 years measuring victory in terms of territory held, resources controlled, populations pacified. Nathaniel Ford had spent 6 weeks measuring victory in terms of days his neighbors got to remain themselves, hours bought for people he might never meet. It was not a definition of success that appeared anywhere in Dominion military doctrine, and yet, standing in that half-destroyed community center, I found I could not argue that it was any less valid than my own. The settlement fell, eventually, in the sense that our forces achieved full operational control of the territory. But something about the word fell felt increasingly inadequate to describe what had actually happened. We had taken the ground. We had not taken the people, not in any sense that mattered, because the moment our forces moved to the next objective, reports began arriving of continued small acts of resistance across Halden's Reach, quiet, uncoordinated, and utterly persistent. I was recalled briefly to the flagship following the operation, ostensibly to deliver a full report to Fleet Marshal Kess, though I suspect Orvane Selk had also requested my presence, out of concern for what he had heard about my state of mind during the siege. I remember sitting across from Kess in his private quarters, delivering a report that, for the first time in my career, I found myself unable to frame in the confident, decisive language our command structure expected. "Fleet Marshal," I said, "we have taken the settlement, but I do not believe we have won anything in the way our doctrine defines winning. I believe we have simply demonstrated, to ourselves as much as to them, that this species measures the outcome of a war by a standard we do not fully understand yet, and until we understand it, I do not believe further military escalation will produce the result you are hoping for." Kess studied me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across his expression that I had never seen before in all my years serving under him. Not anger, something closer to uncertainty. "Explain this standard to me then, Vesic," he said. I told him what I had learned from Nathaniel Ford, from Petra Vell's report on the captured civilians, from Grace Bellamy's translated records of ordinary people continuing ordinary kindness under extraordinary pressure. I told him that this species did not appear to measure a war by whether they controlled territory at its end, but by whether they remained recognizably themselves throughout it, whether their communities continued caring for one another, whether their children still learned, whether their humor and their stubborn decency survived intact regardless of what happened to their cities and their armies. "If that is true," Kess said slowly, "then I am not certain what victory would even look like against them." "Neither am I, Fleet Marshal," I answered honestly, "and that is precisely what concerns me." I returned to the ash vein that night with a heaviness I had never carried before in my career. We had, in the strictest military sense, won at Halden's Reach. Every objective on the operational plan had been achieved. And yet I understood, more clearly than I had understood anything in 60 years of service, that we had not actually defeated the thing we had come to defeat, because the thing we had come to defeat was not a settlement or an army. It was a spirit, distributed across millions of individual people that simply refused to accept our definition of what losing meant. I did not know it yet, standing on that bridge, watching the coastline of Halden's Reach recede on my display as our fleet moved toward its next objective, but the true scale of what we were facing had not yet been revealed to us. Halden's Reach had been a demonstration meant to break humanity's spirit through overwhelming, concentrated force. Instead, it had become a demonstration of something else entirely, a preview of what would happen when this same defiance, this same refusal to be defined by defeat, was mobilized not across a single settlement, but across an entire civilization united in response to a threat it had decided, collectively and without any single order being given, that it would not survive being erased by. That mobilization was already beginning, in ways I would not fully understand until months later, and when I finally did understand it, I would come to see that everything I had witnessed until that point, the trench soldier's apology, the scavenged fleet, the town that refused to move, the calm defiance of captured civilians, had all been small, scattered notes in a symphony that was only just beginning to gather its full and terrible strength. 9 months into the Seoul campaign, I was summoned to a strategy session aboard the flagship that would change the entire course of the war, though none of us understood that at the time. Fleet Marshal Kess had gathered every ranking officer under his command, along with a delegation of analysts from the Dominion homeworld who had arrived to assess why a campaign projected to last 14 days had now consumed nearly a full year without producing the total surrender we had promised the High Council. The lead analyst, a precise and unemotional woman named Cordelia Ashe, though her people had a different name entirely which I will not attempt to reproduce here, presented findings that confirmed everything I had begun to suspect during the siege of Halden's Reach, and revealed a scale to the problem that I had not yet fully grasped. She explained that her team had conducted a comprehensive review of every occupied sector of Earth and had discovered something unprecedented in the recorded history of Dominion conquest. Human civilian production of war materials had not declined in the occupied territories, as every previous conquered population's production eventually had. It had increased, month over month, across nearly every sector we controlled. Factories that had been converted to civilian use following pacification were being quietly, informally, and without any central directive, converted back toward resistance efforts. Agricultural regions were producing surplus specifically earmarked, through informal community agreements rather than any government order, for distribution to areas still actively resisting our forces. What we are observing, Cordelia Ashe explained to the assembled officers, is not a military campaign in the traditional sense. It has become, without any formal declaration that we can identify, the organizing principle of their entire civilization. Every institution, from their smallest farming communities to their remaining industrial centers, has reoriented itself around continued resistance, not because any single authority commanded it, but because the population itself appears to have collectively decided that this is simply what their society now exists to do. I remember the silence that followed this statement. Every officer in that room had been trained, as I had, to understand war as something that could be won by breaking an enemy's capacity or will to fight, and eventually forcing a transition back to peaceful, productive existence under new administration. What Cordelia Ashe was describing was something else entirely, a civilization that had folded the entire concept of resistance into its identity so completely that there was no longer a clear line between their peacetime society and their war effort. They were the same thing now. I want to describe a piece of evidence that Cordelia Ashe presented that evening, because it illustrated the scale of what we faced more clearly than any strategic analysis could. She showed us records recovered from a small farming community that our forces had pacified nearly 8 months earlier, early in the campaign, before we fully understood what we were dealing with. The community had, by every visible measure, accepted Dominion administration peacefully. Local leadership cooperated with our officials. No organized resistance had been detected in the region for months. And yet, buried within the community's agricultural records, her team discovered a pattern of resource allocation that could only be explained by deliberate, coordinated diversion of surplus crops toward resistance efforts in neighboring regions, conducted so quietly and so gradually that our economic oversight systems had never flagged it as unusual. When questioned, the community's registered leadership, an elderly woman named Margaret Ellery, who had cooperated openly with our administration for the better part of a year, did not deny the diversion when confronted directly. "Of course we sent what we could spare," she told the investigating officer, according to the transcript Cordelia Ashe read aloud. "You never asked us to stop caring for our neighbors. You only asked us to stop fighting you directly. We kept our promise. We simply also kept caring for our neighbors, in whatever way we were still able to." This distinction, subtle as it seemed, revealed something profound about the nature of the resistance we faced. Humanity had not organized a rebellion in the way our doctrine understood rebellion, with clear leadership, clear objectives, and a clear structure that could be identified and dismantled. They had instead allowed their existing bonds of community, family, and simple neighborly decency to become the invisible infrastructure of a resistance that required no formal organization at all, because it was built from something far older and far harder to destroy than any military command structure. It was built from people simply refusing to stop caring for one another, and finding, again and again, that this care alone was enough to sustain resistance in ways that confounded every model we possessed. Fleet Marshal Kess, following this briefing, made a decision that surprised many of the officers present, myself included. Rather than ordering further escalation, he authorized the opening of formal negotiation channels with what remained of humanity's coordinated government structures, offering terms that were, by Dominion standards, remarkably generous. Reduced occupation, local governance retained, economic partnership rather than direct extraction of resources. Terms, in short, that any of the 1,000 worlds we had previously conquered would have accepted with visible relief. I was assigned as part of the delegation that delivered these terms to a coalition of human representatives gathered at a neutral location, a decision Kess made, in part, because of my growing understanding of human behavior over the preceding months. I remember the meeting clearly, because it remains one of the strangest experiences of my entire career. The human delegation was led by a woman named Eleanor Whitfield, who our records indicated had emerged as one of the coordinating voices among the scattered remnants of human governance during the occupation, though she held no formal military rank and had, before the invasion, worked in what humans called civil administration. She listened to our terms with careful, unhurried attention, asking precise questions about implementation details, resource allocation, and governance structures, in a manner that suggested genuine consideration rather than performative negotiation. When she finally responded, however, her answer was not what any of us had expected. "We appreciate the terms you have offered," she said, and I understood in that moment, watching the calm certainty in her expression, that we were about to receive an answer none of our doctrine had prepared us for. "But I do not believe you have fully understood what this year has meant for us. You came expecting a war you could win in a matter of days. You have instead spent nearly a year discovering that we do not measure the cost of continuing by the same standard you use to measure the cost of surrendering. We are prepared to offer you terms of our own." I remember the stillness in that room, the sense that something fundamental was shifting beneath us. Eleanor Whitfield proceeded to outline conditions for what she called a full and orderly withdrawal of Dominion forces from the Sol system, framed not as a demand made from a position of desperation, but as a calm, almost administrative proposal, as though the possibility of humanity losing this war had simply never entered into her calculations at all. I watched the reaction of the senior Dominion officer present, a diplomat named Aldrin Voss, whose expression shifted from polite condescension to something close to genuine alarm as Eleanor Whitfield continued speaking. She was not bluffing, in the sense that our analysts understood bluffing. She spoke with the settled confidence of someone stating an obvious fact, the way one might state that a river flows toward the sea. It was not a negotiating tactic. It was, as best I could determine, simply what she believed, deeply and completely, to be true. I asked her directly. When the formal proceedings paused for a private conversation Eleanor Whitfield requested with me specifically, why she believed her civilization could achieve such an outcome, given the overwhelming disparity in military capability that still favored the Dominion by every conventional measure. She considered the question for a long moment before answering, and her response has remained with me every day since. "Commander Thorin," she said, "you have spent this year trying to calculate the point at which we would decide the cost of resisting outweighs the cost of surrendering. I do not believe that point exists for us, not because we do not feel the cost. We feel it every single day, in every family that has lost someone, in every city that has been damaged, in every child who has grown up faster than any child should have to. We feel every bit of it. We have simply decided, individually and together, in ways that were never centrally coordinated, because they never needed to be, that continuing to be who we are matters more to us than any cost you can impose on us for continuing to be it. You are fighting a war you believe can be won through attrition. We are fighting, if you can even call it fighting anymore, a defense of something that was never going to be surrendered, regardless of price." I did not have an answer for her, because I understood, with a clarity that frightened me more than any battle report ever had, that she was telling me the complete and simple truth. The Dominion had built an empire by finding the point at which resistance became too costly to continue for any species we had encountered. We had never met a species for whom that point simply did not exist, not because they were fearless or foolish, but because they had collectively decided that some things were worth an unlimited cost, and had built an entire civilization, quietly and without any single order ever being given, around the sustained willingness to pay that cost indefinitely. I returned to the ash vein following that meeting and requested a private conversation with Orvain Selk, who listened to my account of Eleanor Whitfield's words with the same grave attention he had shown throughout the campaign. When I finished, he was silent for a long time before finally speaking. "Vesic," he said, "I believe we have finally understood the thing that has confused us since the beginning. We built our empire on the principle that every species can be made to calculate the cost of war against the cost of peace, and choose peace once the calculation tips far enough. This species has simply removed that calculation entirely. They are not measuring cost against benefit. They have decided as a whole that certain things are not for sale at any price, and I do not believe any amount of force we bring to bear will ever change that decision, because force only works against something that can be broken, and I do not believe what sustains them can be broken in the way we understand breaking." I sat with his words for a long while, watching the star field beyond the viewport of my quarters, thinking of Daniel Ashworth apologizing for a bridge he could not hold, of Louisa Pemberton organizing barricades from broken furniture, of Nathaniel Ford measuring victory in hours bought rather than territory held, of Margaret Ellery quietly diverting crops to neighbors she had never abandoned in spirit even under our administration, and of Eleanor Whitfield, calm and unshaken, offering us terms of surrender as though the alternative had genuinely never occurred to her as a real possibility. I understood, sitting there, that the Dominion had spent 1,000 years perfecting the science of war, and had, in doing so, forgotten something that this small, unremarkable blue planet had apparently never forgotten at all: that some wars are not won through calculation, because the people fighting them were never doing the math in the first place. The negotiations that followed Eleanor Whitfield's proposal continued for nearly 4 months, longer than any diplomatic proceeding in Dominion history, because neither side, in the end, was willing to accept the other's original terms. The Dominion could not simply withdraw, not because we still believed total victory remained achievable, but because the political structures back on our homeworld required something they could present as a resolution rather than a retreat. Humanity, for its part, would not accept any arrangement that resembled the occupation we had originally imposed, because Eleanor Whitfield and the coalition she represented had made clear, in meeting after meeting, that they viewed continued Dominion presence in their system as fundamentally unacceptable regardless of how favorable the terms might appear. What emerged, eventually, was not a victory for either side in the way either side had originally imagined victory. The Dominion withdrew the majority of its forces from the Sol system, retaining only a small diplomatic and observational presence, framed publicly as the successful conclusion of a campaign to establish diplomatic relations with a newly discovered species, a framing that satisfied the political requirements at home while representing, in practical terms, something much closer to a full retreat. Humanity, for its part, retained complete sovereignty over their system, along with something perhaps more valuable than any territorial concession: a reputation across the wider galaxy, once word of the campaign eventually spread through diplomatic channels, as a species that could not be conquered through conventional force, regardless of the disparity in military capability. I was reassigned, following the conclusion of the campaign, to a small diplomatic vessel tasked with maintaining ongoing contact between the Dominion and human authorities, a posting that Orvain Selk had quietly arranged, I later learned, because he believed I had come to understand this species better than any other officer in our military. I did not resist the assignment. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did not wish to return to the kind of campaigns I had spent 60 years conducting, campaigns built on a science of war I no longer entirely believed in. I spent the following 2 years living, in a limited capacity, among the very people we had come so close to conquering, and it was during this time that I finally came to understand, fully and completely, everything that Halden's Reach and Eleanor Whitfield and Nathaniel Ford had been trying to show me all along. I remember a particular afternoon, perhaps a year into my posting, when I observed a group of human children playing a game in an open field near the diplomatic outpost where I was stationed. The game involved 2 teams attempting to move a ball across opposite ends of the field, a simple enough contest that I had seen variations of on many worlds. What caught my attention was not the game itself, but the score, which one of the children called out to a passing adult with evident frustration. Their team was losing, badly, by a margin that on most worlds I had visited would have caused the losing side to simply stop playing, to accept the outcome and move on to something else. They did not stop. I watched a boy named Oliver Grant, whose name I learned only because I later asked one of the local administrators, gather his team together for a brief conversation before returning to the field with visible, renewed determination, despite the score remaining exactly as unfavorable as it had been moments before. I asked the administrator standing near me, a patient woman named Beatrice Fenwick, who had become something of a guide to me during my posting, why the children continued playing when the outcome seemed, by any reasonable measure, already decided. She looked at me with a small, knowing smile, the kind of expression I had come to recognize among humans as one reserved for questions whose answers seemed obvious to them but apparently were not obvious to me at all. "Commander Thoron," she said, "I do not think they are playing to avoid losing. I think they are playing because the game is not over yet, and as long as it is not over, there is still something worth doing. Losing the score does not mean losing the reason to keep trying." I stood in that field for a long while after the game finally ended, watching the children walk off together, the losing team laughing about some detail of the match with as much ease as the winning team, no visible shame or defeat weighing on them at all, simply the ordinary business of children moving on to the next part of their day. I thought of Daniel Ashworth apologizing for a river he could not hold, of the scavenged fleet, built from grief and stubbornness in equal measure, of Nathaniel Ford, measuring victory in hours bought rather than ground held, of Eleanor Whitfield's calm, unshakable certainty that some things were simply not for sale. I understood, finally and completely, that I had spent my entire career studying war as a discipline built around the question of when a side would decide to stop. Humanity had shown me an entirely different question, one that had never truly occurred to me before this campaign. The question of what a side does when stopping was never actually one of the choices available to them in the first place. I wrote a full account of my observations during this posting, intended originally as a private record for my own understanding, though it was eventually requested by the Dominion's Historical Archive as one of the more complete studies of human behavior available to our people. In that account, I tried to explain, as clearly as I could, the central lesson of the Soul Campaign, though I confess the words never fully captured what I had witnessed with my own eyes. We had built the Dominion on the belief that war was a rational transaction, that every population, given sufficient pressure, would eventually calculate that peace under new authority was preferable to continued resistance under increasing cost. This belief had served us across 1,000 worlds, and I do not believe it was wrong, exactly, for those 1,000 worlds. But humanity had taught us that this calculation was never universal, that somewhere in their history, across 1,000 small tragedies and 1,000 small recoveries, they had built a civilization that measured its own survival not by what it possessed, but by whether it remained recognizably, stubbornly itself, regardless of what circumstances tried to take from it. I think often of a final conversation I had with Eleanor Whitfield near the conclusion of my posting, when the diplomatic relationship between our peoples had settled into something approaching genuine, if cautious, mutual respect. I asked her a question that had remained with me since our first meeting, the question I suppose I had been building toward through every observation I had made during those 2 years among her people. "Did you ever truly believe you could win against us, in the way your people define winning?" I asked her. She considered the question with the same careful attention she had given every question I had ever asked her, and her answer, when it came, was quieter than I expected. "Commander Thoron," she said, "I am not certain winning was ever the question we were answering. I think we simply understood, long before your fleet ever entered our system, that we would rather face any outcome, including the worst one you could imagine, than become people who accepted being erased without a fight. That decision was made a long time ago, in ways too small and too scattered for any single person to take credit for. By the time your ships arrived, it was not really a choice we were making anymore. It was simply who we already were. I did not have a response worthy of that answer, and I do not believe I ever will. I have spent the years since that conversation continuing my study of this small, remarkable species, and I have come to a conclusion that I suspect will unsettle Dominion strategists for generations to come, long after I am gone from service entirely. We did not lose the Soul Campaign in the way our doctrine understands losing, because humanity never fought it the way our doctrine understands fighting. There was no point at which we broke their will, because their will was never a separate thing that could be broken away from who they simply were as a people. We were not fighting an army that could eventually be exhausted. We were fighting an entire civilization's refusal to stop being itself, distributed across every farmer, every teacher, every child playing a losing game in an open field, every grieving parent who still found room for a joke told to an old friend, every captured soldier more concerned with those he had left behind than with his own uncertain fate. I have told this account many times since, to young officers entering Dominion service, to analysts studying the wider galaxy for signs of species we have not yet encountered, and always, I try to leave them with the same understanding that took me an entire campaign, and the 2 years that followed it, to fully grasp myself. War, as I once understood it, was a science of finding the point where continued resistance no longer made sense to a rational mind. I had built my entire career on the confidence that such a point existed for every species, waiting only to be found and pressed upon with sufficient patience and sufficient force. I had spent my whole career believing war was something you win. It took a species with nothing left to lose to teach me it was something you simply refused to end, not because ending it was impossible, but because ending it, for them, was never truly a question their nature would allow them to consider. They did not fight us because they believed they could defeat us through conventional means. They fought us because stopping was never a language their spirit had been built to speak. In the same way a river does not consider stopping when it reaches an obstacle, but simply continues finding its way around, through, or over whatever stands in front of it, indefinitely, until the obstacle itself is what eventually gives way. I still visit that outpost, from time to time, in the years since my formal posting ended, and I still watch the children play their games in that same open field, still losing sometimes by wide margins, still returning to the field the next day exactly as ready to try again as they had been the day before. I understand now, in a way I could never have understood before this campaign began, that this quiet, stubborn, ordinary refusal to be defined by any single outcome, good or bad, is not a weakness in their character, as our doctrine had always assumed such refusals to be in every species we had previously encountered. It is, I have come to believe, the deepest strength I have ever witnessed in my 60 years and more of service to the Dominion, a strength built not from weapons or fleets or clever strategy, but from something far simpler and far harder to ever truly defeat, the quiet collective decision of an entire civilization to remain, against any cost imposed upon them, exactly and unapologetically who they had always chosen to be. I thought I understood war. I have since come to understand that I had only ever understood the version of it that ends. What I witnessed among humanity was something else entirely, something I am not certain any species in this galaxy has a complete name for, though if pressed to offer one, I would call it simply this: humanity unleashed, not as a weapon aimed outward at an enemy, but as a promise kept inward, to one another, that no matter what came for them, they would remain who they were, together, until the very last of them drew a final breath, still holding to that same unbroken promise. That is the lesson I carried away from the Soul Campaign, the one lesson from 1,000 years of Dominion conquest that I believe will outlast every ship we ever built and every world we ever claimed. Some civilizations can be conquered because somewhere within them exists a point where the cost becomes too great to bear. And some civilizations, rare and remarkable and utterly unprepared for by any doctrine we had ever written, simply never built that point into themselves at all.